Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Our mission here, as always, is pretty simple. We take this stack of complex, often quite dense source material.
Yeah, definitely dense sometimes.
And working together, we try to pull out the strategic essence, the real insights that, you need to be properly informed.
Mm-hmm.
Today, we are doing something a bit different, taking a major pivot, really, away from the usual military analysis of nuclear weapons themselves.
Right, less about the hardware specs.
Exactly. We're moving beyond the missiles, the warheads. We want to analyze the fundamental strategic philosophy behind it all, specifically for Pakistan, one of the world's critical nuclear states.
A really crucial area to understand, yeah.
Our sources lay out this meticulous blueprint for a concept they call the nuclear umbrella doctrine.
Mm-hmm.
And this isn't just, national defense in the standard sense.
Yeah.
The way it's framed here is, well, it's presented as a moral, a strategic, and even a spiritual shield.
A shield for the entire Muslim world, the Ummah. That's the claim.
Precisely. We often get caught up talking about payload sizes, proliferation risks.
The technical stuff.
Yeah, the technical stuff. But we rarely dig into the ethical soul or the philosophical core of a deterrent itself.
And that's where this gets really interesting.
The sources, they don't ease us in. They drop us straight into the deep end with some pretty striking contrasts. These really set the tone. They say, power means nothing without purpose.
Whoa, strong start.
Deterrence means nothing without doctrine. And then, the core assertion for today. Pakistan's atom was built to protect faith, freedom, and the future of the Muslim world, not simply for war.
And that statement, that fundamentally reframes everything. It changes the entire why behind the arsenal.
It absolutely does. It's a huge claim.
It is, and it's an incredibly important distinction that shapes our whole analysis today. We're not just looking at, a military document or some standard national security policy paper.
Yeah.
We're dissecting a military doctrine that the sources explicitly say is merged with spiritual philosophy.
Merged. That's the key word.
Exactly. So to really get the implications of this nuclear umbrella idea, you have to accept and analyze this dual nature. It's an attempt, really, to reposition the whole rationale for having the deterrent in the first place.
So moving it from just reactive national survival.
Right. Moving it from being a purely reactive, maybe regional security tool just for Pakistan's own survival into what they propose is a proactive, universal, ethical framework.
Designed specifically for the Ummah.
Designed specifically for collective Muslim security. If you miss that spiritual foundation, honestly, you misunderstand pretty much every tactical and strategic decision that supposedly flows from it.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Starting in Section 1, let's try to formally define this doctrine. The source material is very, very careful with its words here.
Mm-hmm. Language matters hugely here.
It insists the nuclear umbrella doctrine is not just a weapon policy. It's defined explicitly as a strategic philosophy. So what does calling it a philosophy actually achieve? What does that distinction buy them in the global strategic conversation?
That distinction, it's everything, especially when you think about diplomatic signaling. A policy is usually pragmatic, right? Technical, maybe temporary. Focused on immediate responses to specific current threats.
Like adjusting tariffs or deploying troops to a hotspot.
Exactly. But a philosophy that suggests something much deeper. A long-term set of ethical, historical, intellectual principles that are meant to guide permanent action, institutional behavior.
So it signals permanence.
It signals permanence, yes.
Yeah.
By elevating it to a strategic philosophy, the doctrine tries to achieve a few things. First, like you said, it implies longevity, immutability. This isn't just today's plan.
Right.
Second, it suggests the purpose is fundamentally moral, not just transactional or self-interested. It's about principles, not just immediate gains.
And this strategic philosophy, it's trying to solve a pretty classic problem in collective defense, isn't it?
It is. How do you protect others without ending up occupying them or making them totally dependent or undermining their own sovereignty? That's the perennial challenge. The doctrine, as presented, states that Pakistan's nuclear capability acts as the ultimate guarantor. It's the thing that allows smaller, allied Muslim states, theoretically, to keep their autonomy while still benefiting from this protective shield.
Like a strategic roof.
A strategic roof, exactly.
Yeah.
Without demanding, the internal structural pillars like foreign military bases on their soil or heavy-handed political control. That's the ideal, anyway.
And the core idea, the mechanism for this, is defined as collective defense through credible deterrence.
Mm-hmm.
The sources are really clear on this point. An attack on one Muslim nation is considered a threat to all. That's the trigger.
And that's a massive step. It dramatically raises the potential cost, the deterrent threshold, for any outside power thinking about aggression against any member state of this envisioned collective.
So this unified security zone idea, it's explicitly backed by Pakistan's nuclear shield.
Precisely. That's the hard power backing the commitment. But, what really sets this apart, according to the sources, from your typical security pact like NATO or others, is the spiritual mandate. This isn't positioned as just a geopolitical alliance based on, say, shared oil interests or trade routes.
No, it's framed differently.
Very differently. The source material grounds this entire philosophy directly in religious obligation. They state it's inspired by a Quranic command.
And they cite a specific verse.
They do. They specifically cite Surah 9, verse 71. The believers are protectors of one another.
The believers are protectors of one another. So quoting that directly means this doctrine isn't just about political calculation for them. It's framed as applying spiritual law.
Exactly. It attempts to give the military hardware, the nuclear deterrent, this incredibly powerful, non-negotiable moral weight. It connects state action maintaining this deterrent directly to a theological duty.
And that really gets to the heart of the policy versus philosophy thing we were just talking about.
It does, because where a conventional policy might, quite reasonably, prioritize national self-interest above everything else.
Which is standard international relations theory, basically.
Pretty much. This philosophy asserts that collective security for the Ummah isn't just a good idea, it's an ethical imperative. Therefore, the deterrent is supposed to be used within this universal ethical framework.
Positioning Pakistan differently on the world stage.
It attempts to position the nation not just as a regional power looking after itself, but as a kind of universal trustee for the security of the entire Muslim world. It suggests that having the deterrent is actually a means to fulfill this spiritual obligation of mutual protection.
So it transforms the nuclear posture.
It tries to transform it into a statement of global responsibility rather than just, national ambition or regional muscle flexing.
Let's shift focus now into Section 2. The historical roots are, well, they're fascinating because the sources argue this isn't some brand new 21st century idea.
No, they try to give it deep historical legitimacy.
This is where it gets, for me, really interesting. They trace the lineage back centuries.
Yeah.
The doctrine is explicitly portrayed as echoing the early Islamic Confederation model, the one established under the Prophet Muhammad.
Right, and that historical parallel is absolutely crucial for them. It's about establishing deep moral and structural legitimacy. The sources don't just casually mention history, they really use that early Islamic Confederation model, particularly the Madinah period, as the organizational and ethical blueprint.
And what's the key characteristic they emphasize from that model?
They emphasize that the unity established back then was fundamentally defensive. Its primary purpose was to safeguard the early Muslim community from external threats. It wasn't, they argue, designed as a vehicle for imperial expansion or conquest.
So thinking about that early model, things like the Charter of Medina come to mind, where different tribes and groups kept their internal autonomy.
Exactly.
But they were bound by very explicit mutual defense obligations against outside attackers.
That's precisely the model they highlight. The source material emphasizes this balance. Each constituent group or state retained full internal sovereignty, control over its own affairs. But they were bound by this principle of mutual protection and support.
Sovereignty plus mutual defense.
Sovereignty plus mutual defense. That foundational concept is the historical precedent that this modern nuclear umbrella doctrine is attempting to replicate, or at least evoke.
Okay, but let's address the obvious challenge.
Yeah.
How do you realistically bridge that enormous gap between a 7th century decentralized agreement among tribes,
right, in a very different world,
and a 21st century highly centralized nuclear command and control strategy? Critics would surely argue that these historical parallels are purely symbolic, maybe nice rhetoric, but irrelevant to modern strategic realities.
And that's the core challenge the doctrine has to address, absolutely. The sources do try to tackle this directly. They define how they see this ancient framework being modernized.
How?
They say it's achieved by integrating 3 specific modern elements. First, a strategic deterrence, that's the nuclear shield itself, the modern tool. Second, technology integration. This is about making sure the whole mechanism is viable in the 21st century. Think secure C4ISR systems. Command control, communications, computers, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, precision targeting. cyber defenses, all of that.
The tech backbone.
The tech backbone. And third, institutional cooperation. This is the critical element that translates that old mutual defense obligation into modern bureaucratic structures. Structures capable of joint planning, joint exercises, maybe even joint procurement down the line. This is what potentially leads towards that Muslim NATO concept we'll discuss later.
So the modernization effort is about aligning the how, the military science and tech, with the why, the timeless principles of justice and unity they derive from the historical model.
That seems to be the argument, yes. Aligning the preparation and technology with the spiritual law, with a particular emphasis on justice and unity and how it's applied.
Which leads us nicely into the moral foundation. The sources use a specific term for this, deterrence by faith. And they argue this makes it fundamentally different from Western nuclear doctrines. Those are generally based on, concepts like domination, mutually assured destruction, MAD, strategic coercion.
Balancing fear with fear, essentially.
Right. Pakistan's approach, they claim, is guided entirely by Quranic ethics, with a specific focus on restraint.
And that emphasis on restraint is presented as the core ethical constraint, built right into the doctrine's design. They cite another verse here, Surah 2, verse 190. Fight in the way of Allah those who fight you, but do not transgress.
Do not transgress. That phrase is key.
It's presented as the operational boundary. The doctrine explicitly positions the weapon's existence to prevent war, and to defend if attacked, but never to provoke or initiate aggression. The strategic goal, therefore, is framed as stability, not achieving some kind of military advantage over others.
That is a profound difference in claimed purpose. If the ethical mandate truly requires the deterrent to exist primarily as a prevention tool, rooted in this idea of restraint,
then it logically follows that it should be the most patient, the most stable form of strategic power imaginable. It shouldn't be twitchy or easily provoked.
And the sources try to use historical behavior to back this up?
They do. They use history to try and reinforce this very claim. They note that this inherent ethical architecture, this built-in restraint, is, in their view, why Pakistan, despite decades of really intense regional tensions and various provocations, has never actually initiated a major conflict.
So they frame restraint not as weakness.
Exactly. Not as strategic weakness or indecision, but as a deliberate, integrated feature of the doctrine's moral design. Therefore, the nuclear umbrella isn't just about projecting power. It's intended to be seen globally as a symbol of moral authority.
As opposed to
just military arrogance. The moral foundation is the strategic stabilizer in this view.
Okay, let's move into Section 3 now. We're transitioning from the spiritual and historical grounding to the operational logic. How does this actually work day to day?
Right, the nuts and bolts.
The doctrine clearly recognizes that modern threats aren't just purely military anymore. If this shield is really meant to protect the wider Ummah, it has to offer resilience against a much broader range of challenges.
Absolutely. It explicitly mentions economic, cyber, and ideological challenges.
Which makes sense. That expansion of the threat definition is almost mandatory for any serious modern defense strategy, isn't it?
It really is. I mean, think about it. If you provide a perfect physical nuclear shield, but the state you're supposedly protecting can be completely destabilized by, say, a sophisticated cyber attack that crashes their financial system.
Or their power
grid, their water systems. Or if their political stability just collapses because of sustained foreign-backed ideological subversion, maybe massive disinformation campaigns, then what good is the nuclear shield ultimately?
It becomes irrelevant.
Pretty much. So the doctrine recognizes it needs a whole of nation and potentially a whole of collective response capability.
Can we get more specific on those threats? What does economic warfare look like in this context?
Well, the sources point to things like targeted sanctions aimed at crippling key industries, or deliberate currency manipulation designed to trigger fiscal collapse and social unrest. Financial warfare, essentially.
And cyber, beyond just spying.
Oh yeah, way beyond espionage. We're talking about destructive attacks, crippling energy grids, as you said, water purification plants, air traffic control, or even the critical C4ISR networks that the alliance itself might rely on. Disrupting command and control.
And ideological threats. That sounds harder to pin down.
It's perhaps the most subtle, but potentially very damaging. It's about using media, social media, funding proxy groups, using information as a weapon to sow internal dissent within a target country, undermine national unity or resolve, discredit the government, or maybe create a political vacuum that external actors can then exploit. The umbrella, conceptually, has to guard against these non-kinetic assaults, too.
Okay, so managing this very broad definition of security requires a complex structure. The sources lay this out as the three concentric circles. This is the strategic architecture.
Mm-hmm. They structure it logically, starting from the core that sustains the whole thing and moving outwards to its maximum reach.
Circle 1, the absolute foundation, national security. Focus purely on Pakistan's own sovereignty and survival.
Right. You can't project stability outwards if you're fundamentally unstable or brittle internally. This first circle is about ensuring the core deterrent remains credible by guaranteeing Pakistan's own internal economic strength, political stability, and military readiness. It's the non-negotiable prerequisite for everything else.
Makes sense. Circle 2 is the regional shield. This focuses on the immediate neighborhood, the stability of South and West Asia. This is where the umbrella starts to kind of deploy its deterrent influence more directly outwards.
Correct. Extending that stability zone to immediate neighbors and key regional partners.
And then Circle 3, this is the ultimate vision, the Islamic deterrence architecture. This represents the collective protection for the entire Muslim world, the full Ummah-wide umbrella.
That's the realization of the full vision, yes. The broadest application of the doctrine.
Now, the sources use a really interesting phrase here. They suggest that by integrating these three circles properly, the doctrine achieves psychological equilibrium alongside nuclear parity. Let's unpack that. Nuclear parity. Well, that's somewhat measurable, right? You can count warheads, delivery systems.
Roughly, yes.
But psychological equilibrium, what does that actually look like in practice? And how do these three circles supposedly create it?
That's a great question. It's a powerful term, psychological equilibrium, and it speaks directly back to that philosophy aspect we discussed earlier. Parity is having the hardware, the capability. Equilibrium is having the mindset of stability, both internally and across the protected region.
How so?
Well, the sources argue the very existence of this credible overarching umbrella helps alleviate two major sources of instability within the Muslim world itself, or at least within the region covered.
Okay, what are they?
First, it potentially reduces the incentive for regional Muslim states to engage in costly, destabilizing competitive arms races against each other. Why build your own expensive deterrent if your ultimate strategic security is already guaranteed by the collective shield?
Interesting point. And the second?
Second, it reduces the pervasive fear of external coercion or intervention, particularly from major global powers. If states feel secure under the umbrella, the argument goes, they can focus more of their resources and attention on internal development, economic growth, social progress, rather than constantly looking over their shoulder worrying about immediate survival threats.
So internal strength from Circle 1 projects confidence outwards.
Right, which translates into regional stability in Circle 2 by reducing that internal security competition and external fear.
And this culminates in the protective architecture of Circle 3.
Exactly. The core message being sent to all players, both inside and outside the Ummah, is intended to be: this collective is psychologically stable. It's secure. Because its core defense mechanism is not only militarily powerful, but also ethically sound, rooted in this non-aggressive, purely defensive mandate. That stability, that confidence, is the equilibrium they're talking about.
Right, I see. Now let's dive even deeper into the real operational mechanics, the 5 pillars of the doctrine. If the 3 circles are the overall strategic architecture, these pillars sound like the load-bearing beams, the things that make the structure actually stand up and function.
That's a good analogy. This is where the philosophy has to meet pragmatic military and economic reality. These pillars are essentially the operational roadmap. They detail the functional requirements needed to translate that theoretical commitment to the Ummah into a sustainable, credible, strategic reality on the ground.
Okay, Pillar 1, deterrence credibility. This demands, as the sources say, clear signaling of both Pakistan's capability and its restraint.
Credibility in deterrence is always complex, but it's especially tricky here. It requires managing what looks like an inherent contradiction. How do you demonstrate you are strong enough, capable enough to deter any aggression,
while simultaneously appearing restrained enough, principled enough, not to look like an aggressor yourself or like you're seeking hegemony?
Precisely that balance.
Yeah.
So capability signaling, That requires the obvious things. Ensuring a robust, survivable second strike capability. That means diverse delivery systems, missiles, aircraft, potentially sea-based options, hardened command and control facilities, reliable early warning systems. All of that needs continuous modernization and occasional, careful demonstration through tests or exercises.
The hard power aspect.
The hard power aspect. But the restraint signaling is arguably just as critical, if not more so, for this specific doctrine. This involves crystal clear political messaging about defensive intent, strict adherence to stated non-use or first-use policies, and extremely tight centralized command and control to prevent any possibility of unauthorized or accidental use.
Why is restraint signaling so crucial here?
Because if the doctrine fails to project genuine restraint, it just looks like a cynical power play disguised in religious language. The moral authority, which is central to the whole concept, completely collapses. But conversely, if it fails to project real capability, the entire system is just wishful thinking, a paper tiger. Pillar 1 is all about maintaining that incredibly fine, razor's edge balance between perceived power and perceived piety.
Okay. Pillar 2, strategic integration. The crucial linking, they say, of conventional cyber and nuclear systems for multi-domain defense.
Right. We talked about the multi-domain threats, economic, cyber, ideological, kinetic. This pillar is the necessary multi-domain defense response. Strategic integration means all the different defense systems across all domains must work together as a single coordinated ecosystem.
How does that work in practice? Give us an example.
Okay, well, the nuclear shield acts as the ultimate backstop, the ultimate guarantor. Its existence creates strategic space, allowing conventional forces, armies, navies, air forces to operate effectively in lower-level conflicts or crises without the constant paralyzing fear of immediate escalation to the nuclear level by an adversary. The nuclear deterrent stabilizes the environment for conventional operations.
I see. And technically?
Technically, integration implies incredibly advanced collaboration on C4ISR. If this Muslim NATO ever actually forms, it requires shared intelligence platforms, standardized communication protocols so everyone can talk to each other securely, potentially even joint targeting procedures for conventional responses to major threats.
And the cyber piece is key here, too.
Absolutely crucial. It means establishing a shared cyber threat intelligence architecture, seeing the same threats at the same time, and developing collaborative defensive protocols to shield not just military networks, but also critical economic infrastructure across all the allied nations. It's a highly technical, very complex, and ongoing requirement.
Pillar 3 is economic resilience. This argues, quite fundamentally, that deterrence, especially high-tech nuclear deterrence, must be sustained by robust fiscal and industrial stability. It's the economic floor needed to support the strategic roof. Now, this goes right to the heart of a major critique you often hear about feasibility. Given the significant economic challenges many potential member states face, how does the doctrine propose to sustainably maintain this essential strategic floor? It costs a fortune.
This pillar confronts that reality head-on. It acknowledges that strategic longevity, the ability to maintain this posture for decades, depends entirely on economic depth and resilience. You can't sustain a cutting-edge 21st century strategic deterrent indefinitely if your economy is crumbling or completely dependent on others.
So what's the proposed solution?
The source material argues for two main things to achieve this resilience. First, protecting and actively strengthening the defense industrial base within the alliance, particularly within Pakistan itself initially. This means prioritizing sovereign manufacturing capacity, being able to build your own aircraft, missiles, sophisticated surveillance systems, drones, etc., to reduce critical dependencies on foreign suppliers who might cut you off for political reasons.
Self-reliance.
Self-reliance, or at least collective self-reliance within the alliance. This ties into that idea of institutional cooperation and integrated defense industries we mentioned earlier. Second, they stress the need for fiscal shielding. This means developing mechanisms to safeguard national reserves, protect financial systems from hostile manipulation or hybrid attacks, and weather politically motivated sanctions.
So economic defense is part of deterrence.
Absolutely. If the collective can secure its economic independence and stability, then the deterrent posture becomes politically much harder to challenge externally and fiscally more viable to sustain over the long haul. The sources strongly imply that a future alliance would need mechanisms for pooling resources, perhaps development funds or stabilization funds, to bolster key member economies, thus reinforcing the entire structure from the ground up.
Right. Moving on, the fourth pillar, diplomatic posture. This is defined as a commitment to non-alignment while simultaneously maintaining moral leadership. Now, that sounds like an incredibly difficult tightrope walk,
It's perhaps the ultimate diplomatic challenge, yes.
especially in today's geopolitical climate, which is increasingly polarized, and particularly given the clear reliance on specific partners, like Saudi Arabia, which we're about to discuss. How do they square that circle?
Well, non-alignment is presented in the doctrine not just as a preference, but as an operational necessity for the umbrella's credibility with the entire Ummah. Think about it. If Pakistan were formally aligned with, say, the U.S. bloc or the Russia-China bloc,
The umbrella would look like a tool of that bloc.
immediately, it would be viewed by many other Muslim nations as simply a proxy extension of that superpower's geopolitical interests. That would completely undermine the claim that it's a purely values-driven, independent protector of the whole Muslim world. So, the sources argue, non-alignment is essential to maintain neutrality and preserve that crucial moral high ground.
But it's not passive neutrality.
No, that's key. It's not about sitting on the sidelines. Moral leadership, in this context, means actively using Pakistan's diplomatic weight, which is implicitly enhanced by the credible deterrent backing it, to advocate fiercely for the collective interests of Muslim states on global platforms like the UN or the OIC. It's about active, independent diplomacy, guided by the ethical framework of the doctrine itself. It tries to leverage the soft power derived from its claimed moral stance and strategic independence.
Okay. And finally, Pillar 5. Faith as force multiplier. This says spiritual conviction explicitly enhances national resolve, framing deterrence as being driven by faith, not just by fear.
This really circles back to the philosophical core we started with and connects directly to the concept of resolve in deterrence theory.
Explain that connection.
Well, in classic deterrence theory, it's not enough just to have the weapon. The adversary has to believe you actually have the will to use it under certain circumstances. That's resolve.
Right. Capability plus will equals credibility.
Exactly. The sources argue that spiritual conviction acts as a force multiplier here because it dramatically hardens the national will. It shifts the fundamental motivation for potentially using the deterrent from mere rational self-preservation, which can be calculated and potentially deterred, to the perceived fulfillment of a sacred religious duty, the defense of the collective ummah.
Making the resolve seem stronger, less negotiable.
That's the argument. Strategically, this is meant to reduce ambiguity for any potential adversary. The threat of retaliation isn't based on a cold calculation of immediate national gain versus cost, but on a spiritual obligation that is presented as immutable, non-negotiable. This deep conviction, according to the doctrine, ensures that political will endures even under immense pressure during prolonged crises or in the face of seemingly overwhelming odds. It elevates the defense commitment beyond purely material calculations, theoretically making the deterrence far more potent and stable.
That brings us logically to Section 4. We've talked about the philosophy, the history, the structure, the pillars. But how does this complex vision, anchored in ancient texts and supported by these 5 demanding operational pillars, actually translate into reality? How does a philosophy become a concrete treaty or agreement?
The rubber has to meet the road at some point.
The sources point to a very specific, tangible agreement as being the essential first step. The catalyst needed to start realizing this grand vision.
Yes, this is where we see the conceptual framework getting tested by real-world geopolitics. The doctrine, as laid out, seems to recognize that you can't just leap instantly from a theoretical concept to a massive, functioning, multilateral alliance covering, dozens of diverse Muslim nations across continents.
Too ambitious, too complex initially.
Way too complex. It requires an initial, robust, functional demonstration of collective defense capability and, crucially, political commitment. A proof of concept.
And that specific demonstration, that first operational step, is centered around the proposed Pakistan-Saudi Defense Pact 2025.
Correct. The sources explicitly label this proposed bilateral agreement as the first operational step towards the doctrine's ultimate realization.
What's the specific significance of this pact? Why Saudi Arabia?
The significance is potentially huge. This pact is designed first and foremost to immediately and formally expand Pakistan's existing deterrence credibility to shield a partner that is, critical in multiple dimensions. Strategically located at the heart of the Middle East, economically powerful, and spiritually significant.
Saudi Arabia.
Saudi Arabia. By doing this, the pact immediately establishes a strong bilateral foundation for that broader collective deterrent structure they envision in the third concentric circle, the Islamic deterrence architecture. It's the practical working model. the proof that the concept can be operationalized, at least on a smaller scale initially.
And the partnership itself is defined very clearly in the sources. They call it a power exchange, a kind of strategic marriage based on complementary assets, creating two essential halves of a whole.
That's a very apt description from the sources, yeah. It highlights the synergy they believe this partnership creates. Pakistan brings one essential half to the table, the hard security guarantee, the nuclear and military credibility. They provide the protective shield itself, the established deterrent capability, the military expertise.
The protection
The
part.
protection part. Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, provides the other essential half, the necessary operational floor, the global reach, and the ideological weight. That is, its massive economic, diplomatic, and spiritual capital.
Okay, the economic capital is obvious. Saudi Arabia's vast financial resources. The diplomatic capital, too, its global standing, influence in international bodies. But why is Saudi's spiritual capital specifically called out as a core element of this power exchange? How does that contribute strategically?
Yeah, that's a really important element. It connects directly back to that concept of moral authority from the 5 pillars and the deterrence by faith idea. Saudi Arabia, as the custodian of Islam's 2 holy mosques in Mecca and Medina, holds immense, unparalleled spiritual weight and legitimacy within the global Ummah.
Right.
Aligning this deep spiritual capital with Pakistan's established strategic credibility, the argument goes, significantly enhances the moral legitimacy of the entire nuclear umbrella doctrine in the eyes of Muslims worldwide. It helps transform the pact from looking like just another military deal between 2 states into something more profound, a joint guardianship role over shared values and sacred interests. It powerfully reinforces the claim that the umbrella is driven by faith and collective purpose, not just cynical geopolitical ambition.
So the synthesis is, Pakistan brings the means of protection.
And Saudi Arabia brings the economic depth, the diplomatic clout, and the spiritual purpose or validation.
Protection and purpose. The sources define this synthesis as the critical combination needed to sustain this unique, values-based doctrine over the long term.
Exactly. Protection, the credible deterrent, needs purpose, the ethical framework, the diplomatic backing, the economic stability to be meaningful, legitimate, and sustainable for the wider Ummah. The argument is that without both halves working together, the collective cannot achieve genuine strategic sovereignty or long-term security.
But this bilateral pact, even one as significant as Pakistan-Saudi, is clearly positioned as just the foundation, right? The beginning.
Just the beginning, yes. According to the source material, the ultimate goal is much broader, much more ambitious. Toward a Muslim NATO. The nuclear umbrella provided by Pakistan, initially solidified through the Saudi Pact, is explicitly framed as the bedrock, the cornerstone, for building a much larger, formal, multilateral alliance. An alliance that would eventually formalize that Islamic deterrence architecture across many more Muslim nations.
The full realization of Circle 3.
Precisely, the expansion phase. And the sources actually lay out some concrete elements they see as necessary to form this potential Muslim NATO.
Okay, what are they?
Well, first, obviously, a shared defense treaty formalizing that Article 5 style commitment. An attack on one is an attack on all. That's the legal foundation.
Standard alliance stuff.
Standard alliance stuff, yes.
So.
Then, a joint command structure. This is essential for ensuring that strategic integration, we talked about, coordinating military planning, exercises, intelligence sharing, and response capabilities across multiple countries effectively.
Makes sense.
Then, integrated defense industries. This directly addresses the economic resilience pillar, encouraging joint ventures, shared R&D, collective procurement to build up that sovereign industrial capacity across the member states, reducing reliance on outside powers for essential military hardware.
Building collective self-sufficiency.
Exactly. And then there's a really unique element proposed. A dedicated sacred sites protection force.
A specific force just for that.
Apparently so. This would be a tangible, physical manifestation of the doctrine's spiritual mandate. It signifies that a core priority of this alliance is explicitly tied to safeguarding the physical centers of Islamic faith, Jerusalem, Mecca, Medina, presumably. This powerfully reinforces the unique identity and purpose of the alliance, grounding it in shared faith, not just shared political or economic interests. It goes beyond typical military objectives.
That is unique. It sounds like a complete reimagining of what a military alliance is for and what it prioritizes. However, I have to go back to that point of friction, the potential critique.
Please do.
The source material consistently draws this strong values distinction. It stresses that this proposed alliance is values-driven, fundamentally different from Western alliances, which it often portrays as purely transactional based on shifting interests.
That distinction is central to their argument.
Yeah, let's be frank. Any major agreement involving Saudi economic investment, regional stability guarantees, oil politics, it immediately looks like classic transactional geopolitics to any external observer, regardless of the stated intentions. How does the doctrine, or the sources defending it, address that inherent tension? The potential gap between the proclaimed moral purpose and the undeniable strategic and economic realities.
That tension is absolutely central, and the doctrine's proponents, as reflected in the sources, seem very aware of it. They essentially have to defend the values-driven claim against this perception of transactionalism.
How do they do that?
They acknowledge that geopolitical realities, things like choosing strong partners like Saudi Arabia, managing material exchanges, securing economic benefits, these provide the necessary method for implementing the doctrine. You have to operate in the real world with real interests.
Okay.
However, they argue forcefully that the direction, the purpose, and crucially, the limitations of the alliance remain fundamentally values-driven, dictated by the core ethical mandate.
What's the key difference then? How is it not transactional, in their view?
What supposedly defines it as values-driven is the ultimate unwavering goal. A purely transactional alliance might shift its priorities or membership based on changing economic winds or a new strategic rivalry emerging elsewhere. This proposed Muslim NATO, according to the sources, is driven by what they present as an immutable principle derived from faith. Mutual defense of the Ummah and ensuring Muslim security is no longer dependent on the whims or guarantees of external non-Muslim powers.
So the core goal is constant, regardless of shifting geopolitics.
That's the claim. If the alliance were purely transactional, the argument goes, Pakistan might potentially sell its nuclear technology or offer strategic guarantees to the highest bidder globally, regardless of their religion or values. By deliberately restricting the umbrella's protection to the Ummah and grounding the entire justification in the Quranic mandate for mutual protection, the doctrine attempts to demonstrate that the guiding value collective defense based on shared faith supersedes purely material gain or shifting strategic convenience.
That's a critical clarification. It's an attempt to manage undeniable strategic interests, but strictly within a specific, predefined ethical boundary derived from faith.
Precisely. The ethics supposedly define the boundaries of the strategy, not the other way around.
Well, this has been an absolutely extraordinary deep dive. We've traced a really comprehensive strategic philosophy all the way from its claimed roots in Quranic ethics and 7th century confederation models.
It's a long historical thread.
Through a very complex modern operational architecture involving those 3 circles and 5 pillars.
Lots of moving parts.
And culminating in a proposed 21st century defense pact and the vision of a future Muslim NATO. It really forces you, the listener, to analyze strategic deterrence not just as a military tool, but as potentially a deliberate moral and ethical responsibility, at least as presented here.
It is a profound synthesis, absolutely. And it directly challenges the common, often cynical narrative that strategic power must be divorced from spiritual or ethical constraints to be effective. This is essentially an argument that power, to be truly legitimate and perhaps crucially sustainable in the long run, must be guided by some kind of higher purpose.
So, to bring our entire discussion full circle, let's just quickly reiterate those powerful closing contrasts we heard at the beginning, drawn directly from the source material. They really encapsulate the core strategic philosophy we spent this time exploring. The source states, deterrence without ethics is destruction.
Power without purpose is chaos.
But power guided by faith becomes destiny.
Strong words to end on.
Very strong words. So the final takeaway for you, our listener, after navigating all this complex material, is that the nuclear umbrella doctrine is presented by these sources not as Pakistan's national privilege, not just something they have a right to possess for themselves.
No, it's framed quite differently.
It's framed as Pakistan's strategic and ethical promise to the wider Ummah, a promise they claim is rooted in centuries-old concepts of mutual defense, modernized by 21st century technology and strategy, and ultimately governed by explicit ethical and theological constraints derived from Islam.
And this leads us perfectly into our final provocative thought for you to mull over. We spent a lot of time discussing how this doctrine deliberately, formally integrates religious ethics and theological mandates directly into a state's strategic deterrence framework.
Yeah.
The argument presented is that this creates a uniquely moral, authoritative, and highly stable protective shield.
Right.
So the question this raises, and it's a big one for you to consider, is this. If this model were to be successfully implemented, even just partially with the Saudi Pact. How might this explicit, values-driven, faith-based model of collective security fundamentally challenge or perhaps even force a redefinition of existing international defense organizations?
Like NATO or other bilateral security pacts.
Exactly. Organizations which are typically built, let's be honest, almost exclusively on shifting political alignments and shared economic or security interests rather than immutable religious or ethical principles. This Pakistani model presents a potentially unique strategic paradigm where faith isn't just separate from foreign policy or an occasional justification.
It's formalized as its core driver.
It's formalized as its fundamental, non-negotiable driver. What are the long-term implications of that for global strategy? Something to think about.